The river was silent, the crowd was not. Every few weeks, the people of Wapping came to the Thames at low tide and watched someone die. They had been doing this for generations. The gallows at Execution Dock stood just above the waterline, close enough that the condemned could see the river that had once carried them to freedom. The tide that had made pirates rich would wash over their bodies 3 times before anyone cut them down. That was the rule, that was the message, and on the mornings when the condemned happened to be a woman, the crowd pressed in closer than usual, because a woman on the gallows at Execution Dock was something you did not see every day, and the British Empire understood, with cold precision, that rarity made the lesson more powerful. This is the story of what happened to female pirates when the sea stopped protecting them. The Golden Age of Piracy ran roughly from the 1650s through the 1730s, and during those decades, the British Admiralty courts processed hundreds of piracy cases with assembly line efficiency. Piracy was a capital crime under the Piracy Act of 1698. The language was unambiguous. The penalty was death, and the courts that administered it operated in colonial ports like Jamaica and New Providence, without juries, without meaningful defense, and without much patience for the human beings standing before them. For women, these courts carried an additional dimension of judgment that had nothing to do with maritime law. A woman who had sailed with pirates had violated 2 systems simultaneously. She had broken imperial law, and she had broken the social order that defined what a woman was supposed to be. The Admiralty judges, who looked at female defendants, saw not just criminals but anomalies. Something had gone wrong in the natural arrangement of things. The punishment was not just for the piracy, it was for the audacity of having existed as they had. Anne Bonny and Mary Red understood this before they ever entered the courtroom in Spanish Town, Jamaica in November of 1720. By the time their ship was taken by a sloop dispatched by the governor of Jamaica, the 2 women had been sailing with Calico Jack Rackham's crew for months. The night the naval sloop closed in, most of the crew was below deck, drunk on rum they had acquired in their last raid. When the fighting started, the men did not come up. Anne Bonny and Mary Red fought on deck with the men who were still capable of standing. They reportedly cursed the men hiding below, calling them cowards, urging them up to fight. The men did not come. The ship was taken. Everyone was brought to Jamaica. At the trial, the evidence against the crew was straightforward. Witnesses testified to raids, to violence, to the taking of vessels. Calico Jack and most of his crew were condemned and hanged. Bonny and Red were also condemned. The court record from Spanish Town survives, and it is a spare administrative document. Charges, evidence, verdict, sentence, death, the same as the men. Then both women declared they were pregnant. This legal defense had a name: pleading the belly. It was one of the extremely few procedural protections available to women in English law, and it worked by simple biology. You could not execute a pregnant woman without also executing an unconvicted person, and even the Admiralty courts found this inconvenient. The court ordered medical examination. Both women were confirmed pregnant. Their executions were stayed. Mary Red died in prison a few months later. Fever, likely. The records are vague in the way that records about women in these circumstances are always vague. Anne Bonny disappears from the historical record entirely. She was never executed, as far as anyone can determine. What happened to her after the pregnancy stay is simply not recorded. She becomes an absence in the archive, which is its own kind of answer about how much the system cared to track her. Before their trial, in the weeks between capture and courtroom, both women were held in conditions that the historical record describes with the brief and telling phrase, deplorable. No further detail. The records do not elaborate on what deplorable meant for 2 women in a colonial Jamaican prison in 1720, because the records were kept by people who did not consider the details worth writing down. For most captured female pirates, the legal process was both simpler and harsher than what Bonny and Red experienced. There was no famous lover, no surviving court transcript quoted in subsequent histories, no pleading the belly that worked. There was a verdict and a sentence, and an execution date. Mary Critchett's case demonstrates how the machinery worked when it was working normally. An American woman, who in 1729 joined a crew of escaped convicts operating off the Virginia coast. She was captured, tried in Williamsburg, convicted of piracy, and hanged. The historical record gives her a name and a verdict, and nothing else. No pregnancy, no famous last words, no reprieve. She was processed by the system, and the system discarded her. What the system kept was the spectacle. The execution ritual at Execution Dock was not accidental in its design. The condemned were walked from Newgate Prison through the streets of London in a cart under armed guard, and the route was chosen deliberately to maximize the number of people who would see them pass. The crowd gathered along the route, and at Wapping itself. Men, women, children, street vendors worked the crowd. The condemned arrived at the gallows, having already been on display for the length of the journey. The hanging itself was not a modern execution designed for quick death. The drop was short, deliberately short. The short drop meant the condemned died slowly, the rope tightening against the throat, as the weight of the body did its work over minutes, rather than the instant of a long drop. This was called the Marshal's Dance, and the name tells you something about the culture that named it. The body's convulsions as it died were described as dancing, because the people watching had decided to see it that way, because making it a spectacle with a name made it something you could attend rather than something you had caused. After death, the bodies of significant piracy cases were left hanging until 3 tides had washed over them. For pirates whose example the Crown considered particularly valuable, the body was then tarred and suspended in a gibbet cage, an iron frame shaped to the human form, and left to decompose in public view at the river's edge, sometimes for years, until the bones were picked clean by birds, and the cage held only what weather had left. This was done to the bodies of men primarily, but the threat applied universally, and the cages at Wapping were visible to every ship entering or leaving London's port. The message was directed specifically at the maritime community, at sailors, at those who might consider a life of piracy, at those who might shelter or support pirates. The caged bodies at the waterline were the British Empire's most direct form of communication, and it spoke in bones. Before the rope, and sometimes instead of it, there was the whip. Flogging was administered with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a handle from which 9 knotted leather cords extended, each cord capable of tearing skin on its own. The combination of 9 striking simultaneously capable of producing damage that the historical record, when it bothers to describe it at all, tends to describe in the same flat administrative language as everything else. Lashes, wounds, screaming, recovery. If recovery came, the number of lashes varied. A dozen, 39, more than 100 for cases the court considered particularly serious. The punishment was carried out publicly, on the docks or outside the prison gates, in front of whoever came to watch. Townspeople came. Women brought children, for the same reason that women brought children to Execution Dock, because the spectacle was the point, and the point was directed at everyone present, and children were part of everyone. For women specifically, the flogging served purposes that the courts and naval authorities would not have articulated in those terms, but that were perfectly legible to everyone watching. A woman who had commanded men, who had fought on deck, who had operated in the world of ships and oceans, that was supposed to be the exclusive domain of men, that woman was brought to the docks, and made to receive the same physical degradation applied to the lowest offenders. She was made public in her pain. The body that had defied the social order was made into the instrument through which the social order reasserted itself. The crowd watching was supposed to learn something specific, not just that piracy was dangerous, but that this was what happened to women who decided they were something other than what women were supposed to be. Not every captured female pirate was executed or flogged in public. Some disappeared through a different mechanism, one that the historical record is even less interested in documenting. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, in the ports of Portobello and Cartagena, in the plantation economies of the Caribbean, and the coastal settlements of West Africa, women found aboard captured pirate ships entered a legal and social space where the categories dissolved. The Admiralty Court, with its specific procedures and its specific sentences, was a feature of British colonial governance. Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities processed captured women differently, and the difference was not mercy. Women taken from pirate ships in these jurisdictions, particularly women of African or indigenous descent, but not only them, were treated as spoils of war rather than defendants. The archival records from Portobello and Cartagena in the late 17th century describe women removed from captured vessels and redistributed into the colonial economy, into plantations, into domestic households, into arrangements that the records describe with words that obscure what they mean, because the people keeping the records were not interested in clarity about what was being done to these women. Black and mixed-race women found aboard pirate vessels were almost automatically assumed to be enslaved, regardless of whether they had been crew members, regardless of whether they had fought, regardless of their actual status on the ship. The assumption was practical and economically motivated. They had value in the plantation economy. They were absorbed into it. What they had been before their capture was simply not recorded, because recording it would have required acknowledging that it mattered. The particular cruelty of this fate, compared to execution, is that it had no endpoint. Hanging was terrible, and then it was over. The sentence served through forced labor or concubinage in a colonial household had no defined conclusion. It lasted until the body gave out. It produced no historical record, generated no court transcript, left no name in the archive. These women did not become cautionary tales. They became nothing at all, which was in its way a more complete erasure than the gibbet. For those who were imprisoned rather than executed or enslaved, there was a third category of ending that the historical record describes primarily through its silences: the prison ships. The British Navy's solution to the problem of an overflowing prison population was pragmatic and lethal. Decommissioned warships, vessels stripped of their sails, their rigging, their purpose, were moored in harbors at Portsmouth, Plymouth, Kingston in Jamaica, and other colonial ports. Below their decks, in the spaces that had once held ammunition and provisions, people were confined, chained in dark unventilated holds, fed food that the records occasionally describe as spoiled and always describe as insufficient. They waited. What they waited for varied. Some waited for trial, some waited for execution dates, some waited for transfer to penal colonies, some simply waited until they stopped waiting, which happened with regularity, because typhus and dysentery and smallpox moved through the hold of a prison ship, the way they move through any confined, malnourished, unventilated population, efficiently, and without particular concern for the legal status of the people they killed. Women on these ships were not separated from the broader population by any formal mechanism of protection. They occupied the same holds, breathed the same air, ate the same food, and were subject to the same guards. The formal record does not document what happened to them in any detail, because the formal record was kept by people who did not consider the details recordable. The absence is itself the evidence. When women died on prison ships, they died without a verdict, without a sentence, without a date in the record. They were simply no longer present, and the ship continued without them. The entire system, the courts without juries, the short drop at execution dock, the cat o' nine tails on the public dock, the colonial markets that absorbed women into labor economies, the rotting prison ships in harbor, was not a collection of separate cruelties operating independently. It was a coherent system with a coherent purpose, the demonstration, through the bodies of women who had defied it, that the maritime world and the imperial order that governed it were not available to women on any terms other than those the order defined. Anne Bonny and Mary Red have names in history, because their story had elements the subsequent centuries found interesting: the romance with Calico Jack, the pregnancy defense, the famous exchange in which Bonny reportedly told her condemned lover that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. These elements made them narratable. They became stories. Mary Critchett has a name in history because someone wrote it in a court document that survived. The women in the Portobello records have neither names nor stories. They have a category, women taken from pirate ships, and a disposition, processed into the colonial economy, and nothing else. They were erased not by accident but by design, by a system that found their erasure useful and their existence inconvenient. What that system could not erase is what the DNA studies and the genetic records that postdate the system's architects by centuries now quietly confirm about other erased populations. That presence leaves traces that administrative omission cannot entirely remove. The women of the prison ships and the colonial markets and the unmarked graves at Wapping lived, and their living mattered, and the fact that the system that ended their lives also tried to ensure they would not be remembered is not evidence that they should not be remembered. It is evidence of exactly the opposite. That is the history that History Digger is here to tell. Subscribe, because the stories that were deliberately buried are exactly the ones that most need telling.